Hey everyone, welcome back to Toy Habits, and today I'm going to answer the question, why do we need a non-transforming Transformers line by comparing the Transformers R.E.D line with their G1 counterparts? But why stop there? Let's also compare them to the Transformers War for Cybertron line. Why? Because we can. So let's get to it. As a kid growing up in the 80s, I was glued to my TV set, and yes, they really look like this, to catch the latest battles between the two warring factions of alien robots, the Autobots headed up by the benevolent Optimus Prime, and the Decepticons headed up by a ruthless, tyrannical leader by the name of Megatron. Ushering in a new product-based television programming era, the regulatory restrictions for promotional content had all but gone away, leaving us with characters that seemed to appear out of nowhere with absolutely no storyline. These new characters, like the first year's cast, were largely derived from Takara's Diaclone and Microchange lines, with new Autobot robots including cars, mini-vehicles, dinosaurs, and large robots like Omega Supreme, and Decepticon jets and triple changers. Keep this in mind because this is important, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So back to my original question, why do we need the Transformers R.E.D line? I mean, non-transforming Transformers? What are they trying to pull? As a kid, my versions of the Transformers look like this. From the G1 cartoon, iconic robots that seemingly transformed into robots, vehicles, and other electronic devices. So how did Megatron go from this to this? How did Optimus Prime go from a slender, svelte leader to a chunky, blocky robot? And we can't forget about SoundWave. He is the least of the cartoon offenders, and, oh right, this is why I brought up Diaclone. The answer is, the toys were already made, so they were renamed and repackaged as the heroic Autobots and evil Decepticons. So let's start by looking at Megatron, and I'm going to go from the worst offenders down to the least, and I'll also throw in a Transformers War for Cybertron comparison while I'm at it. To answer my own question, let's start by looking at the Generation 1 Megatron figure. Now, don't get me wrong, I love this figure, it was iconic, but this is the absolute worst looking figure in robot mode for the time, as it really looked nothing like the G1 cartoon. I was actually really excited about the R.E.D line, as we can finally get a G1 accurate figure in robot mode instead of a figure that had really amazing tooling for the time that sort of resembled the cartoon, but it's a stretch here, so work with me. So let's take a closer look at these two figures. So what I'm going to do is first take a look at the differences in head sculpts between the Transformers R.E.D version and the G1 version. So starting with the R.E.D line, Megatron has the most cartoon accurate head sculpt I've seen at this lower price point of $19.99. And I'm going to zero in on the gun placement here, as it's sculpted on the side of his arm versus sitting on top of his arm like the G1 design. Now, given that these figures were already produced, the head sculpt looks nothing like the G1 cartoon, and the most obvious departure from the cartoon styling is the gun placement of the barrel of the gun, and I really know nothing about Transformers tooling, but the barrel looks so much better placed behind his back versus tucked under his arm in the Generation 1 figure. Turning the R.E.D line figure around, we can see that the gun barrel is where it should be. Now, looking at the figures from the back, the Transformers R.E.D line obviously has no transforming parts, but the G1 Megatron figure looks pretty ugly from the back, as there is a lot of tooling exposed in his robot mode. You can get a better look at the gun barrel placement here with the G1 Megatron figure tucked under his right arm versus the R.E.D line, where they placed it standing at attention like the G1 cartoon. And let's throw a comparison in with the War for Cybertron figure just for fun. Taking a look at the head sculpts, the Transformers War for Cybertron version did an amazing job capturing the likeness of the G1 Megatron, even down to the expression on his face. It's pretty dead on. The placement of the Decepticon symbol is more centered in the War for Cybertron version, but overall they did a great job replicating the upper half of Megatron, but the War for Cybertron version has a much chunkier look to it. Turning our attention to the accents and finer details on these figures, they even added the blue and yellow components of Megatron, as well as the vent detail under his chest plate. Even with putting on accessories, the War for Cybertron figure can replicate the G1 cartoon look, as SoundWave's gun can store on Megatron's back. Even though the War for Cybertron figure does not turn into a gun, there are nods to the G1 cartoon that they really tried to infuse in this figure. So what is cool about these non-transforming Transformers figures is that they are articulated, so let's take a closer look. He's got articulation at the knees as well as some forward and backward motion at the waist. He can also bend at the elbows, and his head is on a ball joint and can swivel up and down and side to side. Even the feet can move up and down, and all around there is a lot of articulation packed in this figure, and even the side armor can move up and down as well. Now, his gun barrel is in a fixed position, which makes sense for the design. Another cool aspect of the Transformers R.E.D line is that the figures come with a lot of cool accessories. We have the Energon Cube accessory that Megatron can hold, and it just plugs into the port on his hand. There is also an Energon mace, which is made of a flexible plastic, and it even has a port that can also plug in to his arm like so. He also comes with a lot of interchangeable hands to give him some very different looks or ways to display the figure. We have the open versions of the hands here, but all around, a lot of great accessories packed with Megatron so you can play out the scenes from the G1 cartoon. Continuing our comparisons, let's turn our attention to the fearless leader of the Autobots, Optimus Prime. Here we have the Optimus Prime from the R.E.D line and the G1 Optimus Prime that was released in the 80s. The G1 Optimus Prime actually looked a lot closer to the cartoon than Megatron did, so we are heading in the right direction. If we look at the head sculpts, they are more similar than they are different, with the G1 Optimus Prime just having a fatter, chunkier look for his head sculpt versus the R.E.D line Optimus Prime with his more elongated, slimmer head. Now, the cap fronts are very similar with the way that they are laid out and represented, like you would see parts of the vehicle mode, like the grills and the windows, and the G1 Optimus Prime looks like a truck in robot mode, but that's how the Diaclone version was designed, so there's really not much we can do here. If we look at the legs, we do have representations of the gas tanks in robot mode on both figures, and the only thing that's missing on the R.E.D line figure are the wheels, but that's expected since we can't transform the figure. Now let's take a look at the War for Cybertron Optimus Prime for a quick comparison. Looking at the War for Cybertron Optimus Prime compared to the R.E.D line Optimus Prime, Hasbro is really making great strides in making their figures more cartoon accurate to the G1 style than they have in the past. Now, it's not quite an apples to apples comparison because we are looking at the War for Cybertron version, and that looks exactly like the representation you will see of Optimus on screen. That said, the two figures look very similar to each other, and if we zero in on the head sculpts, they are very similar to each other as well. In addition, the overall cab design and the way that the angles and lines are used on these figures are really well done. Like Megatron, they have replicated the waist detail with the design and coloring, and the differences really lie in the legs. And if we look closer, the War for Cybertron version of Optimus has lost the gas tanks on the sides of his legs, and there are no wheels on the R.E.D line version. But like I said before, this is what a cartoon accurate sculpt should be, and they are moving in the right direction. Let's take a closer look at Optimus Prime's articulation on the R.E.D line version. Now, he has an elbow articulation and a lot of movement in the joints there. A very cool feature on this Optimus Prime is that the windows open up to display his Matrix of Leadership, which gives you a lot of options for how to display this figure. He also has a joint on his knee that bends, and like Megatron, you can also adjust his feet. He also swivels at the waist, and his head is on a ball joint, so you have great range of motion there. Again, great articulation for a non-transforming Transformer. Optimus comes chock-a-block with a lot of cool accessories, far more than I expected for this figure, but first up we have his G1 gun, and it has some great detailing, and they did a really great job adding more lines and definition that we didn't see with the G1 release from the 80s. Now, I took out his Matrix of Leadership, but that just pops into his chest, and getting a closer look, it's a really cool piece, and it looks the same on each side, but they did pack a lot of fine detail into the Matrix here. He also comes with his Energon axe, which is what you see in the cartoon, and it's a very cool accessory that I've only seen in the Masterpiece line, so that's a bonus here. He also comes with a gaggle of hands. I'm not going to pick them up, but I will give you a closer look at them. He comes with a pointer, some variations of his open hands, and a closed fist, as well as the hands that are attached to him already. Last but certainly not least is Megatron's right-hand man, SoundWave. The most cartoon accurate version of the bunch is the G1 SoundWave comparison to the Transformers R.E.D version. Although the G1 SoundWave was reused from his Diaclone version, I feel like they really nailed the head sculpt on the G1 version, and although they are stylistically a little different, they do look very similar to each other. They did a great job incorporating the features of SoundWave that we loved, and even incorporated the eject buttons that actually function on the R.E.D version. Both the G1 cassette doors open and close, and the Transformers R.E.D also opens as well, which was a nice surprise. They also did a great job replicating the Walkman buttons that you see on the G1 version as well. Even if you look at the legs, they also did a great job replicating the overall styling and colors of the leg sections, and this even extends down to the feet, although the G1 SoundWave from the 80s does have a hole where his feet fold in for transformation. Alright, let's do a quick comparison with his War for Cybertron counterpart. The War for Cybertron line did an amazing job representing the G1 likeness compared to the cartoon version we grew up with from the 80s, so let's take a closer look at the head sculpts, and right away you will notice the glowing eyes as there is a translucent red piece on his head which lets light in, giving him that effect. Very similarly to the G1 figure, the War for Cybertron figure also incorporates the eject button and the doors, and they also did a great job making the legs look like one solid piece on the War for Cybertron figure. So overall, they did a great job bringing that G1 feel to the figure, but they still missed the mark with a direct translation to the 1980s cartoon. SoundWave has articulation in the elbows and again in the knee joints, and his feet also move like the other figures in the line. He can move forward and backwards at the waist and swivel from side to side. You can also move his head quite a bit thanks to a ball joint, which is pretty flexible. Turning the figure around, you can even see the battery compartment like we saw in the original G1 figure from the 80s. All in all, another great design to a classic figure. Taking a look at SoundWave's accessories, he comes with a cassette, but the coloring makes me think that this is Laserbeak rather than Buzzsaw. And it actually slots into his chest, and you can store it in his chest, which is a very cool feature. All you need to do is pop it in his chest and close the door, and voila, you're done. He also comes with a gun, but it has a fixed piece that does not shoot out. But they did a really good job paying homage to his G1 gun here with the reds, the blues, and the silvers, and the overall styling. He also comes with some extra fist if you are so inclined to swap them out to increase the posability and displayability of this figure. We also have his shoulder-mounted cannon, and my only gripe with this cannon is that it does not seat well in the port on his shoulders. Now, I've seen this in other reviews, and I'm glad that this is not a defect just in my figure, but I have a hard time getting it to seat properly as the peg must be too shallow or mismatched in size. The coolest part of these Redline figures is you can recreate some of the cooler scenes from the Transformers cartoon where we have Optimus Prime battling Megatron on top of a dam from the episode Danger at the Dam. Although Hasbro tries to recreate the G1 cartoon look in their figures, I still think we need the Redline so we can have a G1 cartoon accurate figure sculpt in the line. Let us know what you think about the Redline in the comments below, and please remember to hit that notification bell so you can stay up to date with all of our latest videos, and please remember to like, share, and subscribe.